about you, but when I was a kid, we called the community that we lived in a neighborhood. And in that neighborhood, there were other children, and we did things together as a community. We did things like playing cowboys and Indians. We played matchbox cars. We played football. My yard was the big yard, so we played football there. But there was a big gardenia bush in the middle, and we had a house rule. You could only run around it twice, or it was a 5-yard penalty, because that was an extra blocker. So we did those kinds of things, and we enjoyed that. And the worst thing in all the world in that community was to be, to have a fight and be on the outs with your buddies, because you had no one to hang with until you kind of made up. And it was a small enough neighborhood that usually happened within about an hour, because we usually got pretty bored if we didn't have anybody to play with pretty quickly. Got on and went into school, and of course in high school you have all kinds of communities. You have the band geeks and the jocks, and you have the cheerleaders who were kind of like female jocks in a way. You had the nerds who were the eggheads, and you had the people who were, the rednecks where I came from, and then you had the losers who didn't have anybody to hang with. They kind of were the ones, being a bona fide band geek, I had a group to hang out with, and I always felt bad for the losers who had nobody to hang with. And those kinds of things are the way we defined our life in our community. And you go off to college, and they have communities they call things like fraternities and sororities. And then you still had the band geeks, you still had the nerds, you still had the jocks, you still had the cheerleaders. It's kind of weird to me. They had male cheerleaders as well as female cheerleaders, so I had to kind of get used to that. And there were still the losers who had nobody to hang with, and I still felt bad for them because I could kind of hang out with a lot of different people, and even though I was part of the band geeks, I still had friends in some of the other communities. So you get out of school and you get into life as a big person, and you realize there are still communities, there are still things that people gather in. There are political parties, there are sports groups and clubs, go Gators, go Knowles, go Jags, go whoever. There are clubs like Rotary clubs and Optimist clubs. I always thought that was a great name for a club, even though I was never part of it. There are all kinds of things that you can be a part of, and many good communities that do a lot of good things. There are a lot of times, though, obviously there's churches and denominations and all kinds of ways you can belong to things in that kind of a community. But the reality is that a lot of times these communities don't really fulfill our deepest longing. And the truth is that all of us, long to be part of a community of acceptance. All of us long to be part of something larger than ourselves that gives meaning to our life and helps us to know how we can connect with others. And sometimes we'll be part of communities of acceptance even if they don't fulfill what we're really looking for, and sometimes even if we don't feel fully accepted. I always think of people, in some communities, kind of like Woody Allen, I think it was, who said, I wouldn't want to be part of any group that would have me. Have you ever felt like that when you were in a group that you were in and you're wondering, why am I part of this? Well, the bad news is that there's a lot of times when groups that are meant to be groups of acceptance don't act that way. And one of the sad things is that the reality, the truth is that very often the church has not acted as a community of acceptance. It has acted like a community of exclusivity, almost like a country club at times. Now, and there's nothing wrong with country clubs, believe me, and some communities are designed to be exclusive. I mean, you may want to join Augusta National Country Club, but if you're a woman, good luck. If you're Jewish, good luck. If you're black, I think they've got a couple of black members. I know that Tiger Woods guy, I think he's a member. Of course, I guess if you're Tiger Woods, you can probably join any country club you want to, And I don't know if it's still that way, but there are groups that are set up to be groups that are exclusive. And that's part of their purpose. I think the church has been very confused over the centuries with what it's called to be. I think very often the church has set itself up as a community of exclusivity. Now understand that a lot of times we've used theology as the reason for this. And we have understood what those who have been in charge and in power have called orthodox theology as a way to exclude those who don't fit, who we don't like, or who sometimes aren't what we think they ought to be. Certainly we've used that as an excuse for why certain people are considered sinners or not, or why they don't qualify to be in leadership or not. For many years, of course, we used the Bible to exclude women from places of leadership. We used the Bible as an excuse to affirm slavery in the South. during the 1800s and earlier. But we've come to see that those kinds of exclusions, and using the Bible as an excuse for that, isn't the kind of community God called us to be. And so today, even as we look around, there's certainly many churches that are very successful and are very large and are very good at being churches or communities of exclusion. If you don't think a certain way or believe a certain way, if you don't carry a certain Bible or speak in certain tongues or have some other sign of being someone who is loved and approved and accepted by God in their eyes, then you're not acceptable in their company. I think one of the more troubling examples is where churches talk about being accepting and welcoming, but then when you get there, you get what I call the bait and switch model. They start telling you how unwelcome you really are, like you are, and you really shouldn't be like you are, or God will never love you, and you certainly aren't getting into heaven with them. Now, what we struggle with is we've certainly got to understand that God does want to transform us. We are not who we want to be. We are not what God wants us to be. But I wonder when I see how exclusive we sometimes make the church, whether God intended the church to be a community of exclusivity or a community of acceptance. When I read this passage this morning, it helps me to think about this in some new ways. Jesus was a part of a community of people, and he was calling people to be a part of that thing that would become the church. And in the midst of this, he walks through town and he sees Matthew sitting at his booth. And Matthew is a tax collector. And if you think tax people aren't popular now, you should imagine what it was like then. I mean, can you imagine, I used the example in the earlier service, if for some reason we were occupied by Russia and their soldiers were bounded on every side of us and in our neighborhoods and communities to make sure that we were around, and some of your neighbors in the apartment complex or the housing area where you live had decided to work for them, for those hated Russians, and had somehow decided not only would they work for them, but they would take money from you so that those soldiers could be there in your midst and make sure you obeyed those hated Russians. And not only was that person taking that money from you for them, he was taking more than he was authorized to take in order to live his own lavish lifestyle. Probably not the most popular guy in the neighborhood. And when you realize that, you realize for Jesus to have come and to have said to Matthew, "Follow me," was certainly a shock and an outrage to the neighbors who saw that. But even more, there was the religious dimension. One of the things that Brian McLaren, an author and theologian, talks about is how for the Pharisees, they believed that if they could just get everyone to believe like them, to act like them, and to be like them, then God would send a Messiah to run the hated Romans out and allow Israel to once again rule itself as it had under King David. And so anyone who was not cooperative with this program was certainly seen as someone who was not just religiously outside, but in every way, socially, culturally, nationally, in every sense of the word, that person would have been someone who would have been excluded from community. They would have been outside what was accepted and welcomed. And yet Jesus goes and sits down, not just with Matthew and a couple of other sinners, but Matthew, the writer of the gospel, says there were other tax collectors who came and who sat there with Jesus. And to the good religious folks, the God-fearing, Bible-believing, worship-going people, that was an outrage and an offense to the exclusiveness that they saw in God's community. Here's the challenge. When Jesus invites and welcomes and sits down to eat with those people, it seems to me what he is modeling is something that says to us that God is more interested in a community of acceptance and welcome than a community where everybody has the right beliefs, the right Bible, the right way to speak or worship or do their thing religiously. God is willing to sacrifice what we would call righteousness for the sake of the invitation to hospitality to know the grace of the living God.